What would you do if there's a fire in your house? Do you try to put it out, or do you run for your life? And if you run, where do you go? And do you try to come back? Well, climate change is already starting fires, figuratively and literally, in the houses of millions around the world. What happens when they're forced from their homes? Let's talk about climate change and migration. I'm Adam, a climate scientist with a PhD from Oxford, sharing what you need to know about climate change. And joining me today is Sophia Burton from the organisation Migration Matters. So, Sophia, can you tell us what Migration Matters actually is?
Sure. Migration Matters is an educational nonprofit in Berlin, Germany that works to make public debate about migration topics more nuanced and evidence-based, ultimately with the aim of helping people have better conversations about migration and to combat increasing polarization and discrimination in society.
And actually, Migration Matters has a whole video series about climate change and migration. What's the name of the series again?
What? You don't remember?
Sorry.
It's called The Big Climate Movement, Migration and Displacement in Times of Climate Change.
There will be a link somewhere up here and also at the end if you want to check that out. Now, Sophia, climate change is forcing people to move out of their homes through a number of different forces. But what are the fires that climate change is effectively lighting in people's homes?
So we can actually break down disasters in two categories. So you can look at sudden onset disasters, which are things like hurricanes, floods. These are things that happen really rapidly and that often we aren't prepared for. And then there are slow onset disasters or changes to the environment, which are things like desertification or sea level rise or coastal erosion. And these are things that happen over years or over decades.
And I think maybe it's easy to imagine that if there's a fire in your house, once you put out that fire, maybe you move back into that house. But if a wall of your house is gradually falling down over many years, maybe you just accept that house isn't a house you can live in. And we often, in richer countries, imagine that when people migrate because of environmental disasters, that means moving from lower income countries, often in the global south, to high income countries. But actually the picture is much more complicated than that, right?
Very much so. So a lot of migration that we see is internal migration, so within a country or regional. You know, this kind of fear-mongering around we're going to have millions or billions of people moving to the global north because of climate change ignores a lot of the nuance and complexity in the debate and in the research. So think about this fire, right? A fire happens. You need to get out of there as quickly as possible. You need to get to safety. You are not going to start planning a big trip, find your passport, pack your things, change your whole life, move to another country.
And I think this kind of oversimplification of this topic happens in lots of different ways. Another is that it's often very hard to define who is actually moving because of climate change. So even if someone does move because of some kind of extreme weather disaster, it's often not possible to say that that disaster happened purely because of climate change. Climate change may well have played a really important role in making it more severe, more likely. You can't just draw a kind of one-to-one link between the weather event and the disaster. And on top of that, people often move not just for one reason.
Right. So climate change isn't kind of a factor on its own. It intensifies other factors, and other factors of migration. They can be social, political. So let's look at an example. In sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, around 50% of people's livelihoods depend on agriculture. So if there are changes in the weather and the climate that affect their ability to farm and make money and live, then their reasons for moving are not only because of the environment, but they're also economic. And so it's really difficult to just pinpoint only climate change as a reason.
And at the same time as that, just people's ability to move is also dependent on lots of different factors. It's not just dependent on what's happening in the environment, in the weather around a person. It also depends on how resilient that person is, how privileged that person is in lots of ways.
Totally. So let's say your apartment's on fire and you're in your 80s, or you have a broken leg, or you're heavily pregnant, it's going to be a lot difficult for you to get out of that fire safely than if you're 25 and super fit and healthy. So a lot of people become very vulnerable in these situations. They may even become trapped and not be able to move. And so it's important to remember that some people are more vulnerable in that they can't move, which is a problem, and they need assistance. And also some people really don't want to move.
Climate change affects everyone everywhere, but it doesn't affect everyone everywhere in the same way. You know, if an extreme weather disaster hits in a relatively wealthy country, how that country is able to respond is very different to a country which is already struggling with resources.
But also looking at an example, for instance, in the US, Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, in that case, you had, about 85% of the population was able to evacuate in time, but 15% were not, primarily Black people who were also primarily poor. So people are affected everywhere by this.
So climate change is something that is fundamentally unfair. It's primarily caused by the richest people in richest countries and primarily felt by a lot of the poorest people within countries and the poorest countries. On top of that, then some people have to move, as we've discussed. And then what we often see is richer countries turning around and saying that movement is somehow unacceptable, which I find somehow almost paradoxical.
There's this term climate justice, and part of that is about, should higher emitting countries, should richer countries in the global north be contributing more in order to help people in poorer countries who feel often the effects, but didn't necessarily contribute to the emissions that made the climate change happen. And it's not always about migration, right? It's also about finding ways to adapt locally.
Yeah, and I definitely know that if someone started a fire in my apartment, I would want them to help me put the fire out and make my flat more fire resistant. And if needs be, help me move. And that, I guess, is the essence of climate justice, people helping you deal with the situation that they caused. It's also the essence of something that's called loss and damage, and I made a video all about that. The link, again, should be somewhere over here above Sophia's head. Now, Sophia, as someone who's a physicist by training, I always want to get down to the numbers. Everything we've already discussed suggests getting to hard numbers is going to be hard in this topic, though.
Very much so. So the numbers that we have that are really reliable are these internal displacement figures. So we know that in 2022, for instance, of the approximately 61 million internal displacements that occurred, over half of these were due to natural disasters, more than were due to conflicts. It's much more difficult to predict numbers about how many international climate migrants that we're going to have. So there have been a lot of headlines in recent years. We've seen, 50 million, 100 million, even up to 1.5 billion. And I would really urge you to take these numbers with a grain of salt because they are looked at very critically by the academic community. They're not necessarily rooted in fact. There's a lot more nuance to the debate, and throwing out these numbers that don't have any scientific backing is problematic.
I feel like often when we talk about this entire topic, there's kind of undertone that migration is something that is fundamentally problematic, that it's bad for states which receive immigrants especially. What can be done, I guess, to make sure that that isn't the case? Because, it's clear that people are going to have to move as certain parts of the world become harder to inhabit.
Yeah, so migration is often looked at as a problem generally, even taking climate change out of the equation. And when it comes to climate change, it's often seen as like a demonstration that we've failed and people have to move, but it also can be seen as a solution or as a way for people to adapt. And so there can really be benefits for the individual who has migrated, for the host country receiving the migrant, and also for the home country. So if we break these down, the individual themselves, they have the opportunity to live somewhere where they maybe get a better job or have better access to healthcare or education. The host country can benefit in that migrants bring different skills, fill gaps in the labor market. A lot of countries in the global north have aging populations and need migrants. And then the home country can benefit as well because migrants tend to send remittances home, and remittances basically means money. So this is kind of like the ideal scenario, like a win-win-win scenario where all three parties can benefit.
It's a topic where I feel like we so often just talk about it in such black and white terms, and often people are just like entirely for or entirely against migration. But hopefully this conversation, and I guess your entire organization, is about finding the nuance in that and finding actually the cases where things can be made more positive and having more constructive conversations about the topic.
Yeah, definitely. And I would say also not just about the benefits, but also seeing migration beyond this pro and con framework, seeing it as something that's normal, that's going to happen, that has always happened, but understanding, like you said, more the nuances and complexities that are there. So, think critically when you see those headlines or hear those politicians speaking about climate refugees.
And for a lot more of that nuance and that grey between the black and white way we normally talk about migration, especially in the context of climate, you really want to check out the series, The Big Climate Movement.
It's here somewhere, right?
Yeah, I think it'll be between us if I do my editing job correctly. Okay, until next time. Bye.
Bye. Sorry, this is stupid. You should take that out.